in labor markets? Or are you and your co-authors using human capital theory as a shorthand for a series of policies that are premised on human capital theory? So to put that differently, is human capital theory a shorthand for the ways in which human capital theory has affected education? Is that what you are arguing? So if you are arguing the former, that human capital theory is a theory that explains why education pays off in labor markets, then we would like to know, do you and your co-authors argue that there is ample empirical data to prove that human capital theory does not usefully explain the relations between education, earnings, and economic growth? So in other words, are you arguing that the theory does not explain real world phenomena, or are you arguing that it does so, only it does so inadequately? Further, we also wanted to know, are you arguing that the theory does not address the key problem that you say in the book is facing the world today? And that key problem that you pose is the problem of jobs scarcity. So if your argument is the latter, that HCT doesn't address this problem of job scarcity, are you then saying that the policies that have been developed because of human capital theory are what needs to change? In other words, are you saying that you are addressing the unintended consequences of human capital theory rather than human capital theory itself? So, lots of tough questions. We're all very excited to hear your responses. And Steph and other members from our reading group, I'm sure will jump in during the Q&A if there's any time, and pose a couple of other interesting questions that we would still like answers to. So over to you, Professor Lauder.
Well, thank you very much, Palisa. Thank you very much, Prisha and Stephanie. I do recall very warmly the launch of REAL, and I'm delighted to be back here with you today, and delighted to have so many people coming into this particular seminar and the discussion thereafter. So very many thanks for that. Let me just give you a bit of background in response to Palisa in terms of the questions. I've shaped this PowerPoint around those questions. So I hope that many of them will have been addressed by the time I come to the end of this presentation. If I haven't, then you can certainly ask me to elaborate further. So let me just give you some background, because it will begin to address some of these questions. In 2011, Phil Brown and I were in New York seeing our editor, James Cook from OUP. And we said, there's a follow-on book that we need to do as a result of the Global Auction, which was the book that we had just published with him. And that is that the Global Auction, the analysis we gave in that, raises a whole series of questions about human capital theory. So he agreed, he thought that was a great idea. We had a glass of wine on it, and we left in 2011 to start this book. Well, you realize it's 10 years since, or 9 years till the point where it was published. So it's been a very long venture. Sinyi Chung came along with us, and it's taken us this long to actually get to the point where we thought we could publish the book. One of the reasons why it took us so long was because human capital theory is a moving target. So we gave seminars in Berlin, and they go, oh, you don't understand human capital theory. Thank you. And you also need to develop an alternative theory, otherwise no one will take any notice of you. So that was kind of helpful and interesting. Then we go to Harvard, and at Harvard, I give a talk on the data so far, and they go, ah, yeah, but that's fine. We agree with you, absolutely, but that's not where the action now is. What we're interested in, most of all, is skill-biased technical change theory, which is a kind of son or daughter, if you will, a spin-off from human capital theory. So we go, okay, we've got to look at this stuff. Then I go to Oxford and I give a seminar at Oxford, the economists there, and they go, oh, yeah, all good, but you're way behind the 8 ball again. There's Auto-Levine-Monet's theory, the ALM theory, and you've missed that out. So you can see that all the way along, wherever we went, the orthodox economists that we were talking to were going, yeah, nice try, but. And so it's taken us quite some time to nail this moving target. And even today, I have very close colleagues who are human capital theorists, and they still say, oh yeah, but you haven't quite got it. Well, we have got it, we think. And we think we've got it because of the connections in the next slide up, which will come along here. And you'll see that there is a connection there between education, productivity, and income. And the assumption that was made by the founders of human capital theory, Schultz, Becker, and Mintzer, argued that education led to greater productivity, which led to greater income. So the key there was that if you have education, then you will be more productive as a worker. And as a result of that, you'll be paid more because productive workers are paid more. Well, these assumptions run like a silver thread through, in various guises and in various ways, through all those theories I've just talked about and which I'll come back to shortly. So you can see that we had a kind of difficult time in writing a book which was at least to be taken seriously by orthodox economists, but also addressing the wider policy and education issues that were prompted by what we saw as the failure of human capital theory. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that it's important. Why is human capital theory important? Well, because it's provided the theoretical and empirical justification for claims to promoting national competitiveness in the knowledge economy, and especially by expanding higher education into mass higher education. And the key here is the idea that human capital theory is related to the knowledge economy. The idea that in the knowledge economy, which is an imaginary, and it's not a correct imaginary either, in this so-called knowledge economy, we needed more and more educated people to operate the new forms of technology and soft skills, as they're called, in relation to that new technology. And that as a result of that, those who were prepared to gain an education would win. So it's a win-win policy scenario, both at the national level, because the more educated people you have, the more productive they'd be, the more competitive an economy would be, and also at the individual level of the graduate. So if we move on to the next slide, we have a picture. And this is a picture of Bath Abbey. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is the two ladders climbing up the front columns of the Abbey. And these are Jacob's ladders, and they are angels ascending up the ladder to heaven. And you'll also notice that one or two of them, like for example, the bottom left-hand side there, they're angels who are falling down because they've sinned. And what we've got now in terms of this discourse relating human capital theory to the knowledge economy is in fact a secular version of this, where if you ascend the credential ladder, you will end up in a kind of contemporary heaven where you'll have a well-rewarded job. So these are the promise, or that's the promise that's being offered. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll see that, as I've indicated, human capital theory is a moving target, so quite difficult to actually nail it completely because there's always a variation. And one of the great philosophers of science, Imre Lakatos, used to argue that any research program with sufficient ingenuity could always be revived. you can never, as it were, have a total knockout blow. And so we need to keep that in mind. And certainly there's been much ducking and diving by some of our orthodox colleagues in these terms. So from contemporary changes to human capital theory, we also have skill-based technical change theory, and a variant of it, the Autor-Levin-Murnane theory. And the only difference, I'll say the only difference, there are other differences, but a difference between human capital theory and skill-based technical change theory is that there's a sense in which it's the technological revolution which induces a demand for higher skilled workers. And we have another paper which came out in 2018 in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, where we try and nail SBTC theory as far as we can. Okay, so let's move on to the next. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. The theoretical assumptions. Now, human capital theory has got two interesting features to it. The one is that it's a very well-developed theory. And the second thing is that it has longevity. For social science theories, even economic theories, it's lasted a very long time. It's lasted from the mid-1950s through to now. It still has currency. So now I want to just indicate, and I'm going now to look at some of the methodological questions that Felisa was asking and her group were asking about. That simple diagram, which I showed above, which linked education to productivity to income, outlines the empirical relationships between these three factors. But it doesn't do full justice to the worldview, which actually underlies the theory. Now, this worldview, I mean, Kuhn talked about worldviews in sophisticated theories in terms of paradigms and the top end of the paradigm, as it were. Imre Lakatos calls it the hard core, or the center of a theory, and I'll choose the term worldview because that's what it expresses. So, for example, how does it express the view of a worldview? Well, it makes assumptions about human nature. So the most significant of classical constructs is that of Homo Economicus. So Homo Economicus is basically the view that people act rationally to pursue their own self-interest. In education, it means the reason why people take education is because they want a good job. So you can begin to see already what's going to emerge from this. But before I move on to that, which of course has to do with neoliberalism and education policy, we'll also notice that there's an assumption of meritocracy in human capital theory. And I shall develop that shortly in a second. Originally, there were what-if assumptions, which assumed that these what-if assumptions did not reflect reality. In the early stages, Becker and co. were really under the influence of Friedman in his view of economic methodology, which argued that it doesn't matter what kind of constructs you have, theoretical constructs you have, providing they produce good predictions. So this is known as instrumentalism. And it's also known in philosophy of science as fictionalism. So you might have Homo Economicus, but there's no good complaining about this as being some kind of male assumption, although indeed it is, but that it's there simply to aid good predictions. However, as Becker moved over time and became more famous, that assumption of Homo Economicus, as well as many others, he took to assume, or assumed them to be real, that people actually were driven by self-interest. And that is what Michel Foucault picked up on when he was talking about the connection between human capital theory and neoliberalism. And there you see the centerpiece of neoliberalism, because it assumes that people are fundamentally self-interested. And it doesn't matter what range of policies you look at, you'll find when you scratch beneath the surface that that assumption is typically there with neoliberal theories. The second point to make is that human capital theories seem to approximate universal laws, or law-like regularities, to use the technical term. And the reason for that is that these people are empiricists, and they therefore thought that the aim of social science and economics in particular was in fact to produce predictions which would be universal. And you can see how that filtered down. So the World Bank, for a very long period of time, simply took human capital theory as read, and that it could be applied to any particular context or country. Now, let me just enter a caveat here. When we're talking about any particular context or country, in the alternative theory that we're going to articulate, we are very clear that we're talking about contexts. So when we talk about the death of human capital, we're not talking about the idea that there aren't connections to be made between education, skills, and the labor market. It's just that they will not be universal. They will be of a particular context. And whereas human capital theorists to this very day continue to be empiricist, by and large, the assumptions that we make are realist, that what we're looking for is explanations for the particular outcomes that we can document through data patterns. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? So this is a slide which I stuffed up. I got carried away with all the options that I could use, and being a technological idiot, I didn't do them right. But this basically says that canonical, or the original human capital theories, assume that in a perfectly competitive labor market, employers will always choose the best candidates, regardless of ethnicity, race, and social class. This then leads to the presupposition of a worldview that includes meritocracy. So I've begun to sketch out some of the worldview underlying human capital theory. And that's going to be important to what we do next. So if we have a next slide. Okay. We started off in terms of our own approach with the empirical claims as indicated as a result of our work on the global auction, which signaled that there could well be a clear problem with human capital theory. Theoretically, there are many problems with human capital theory, and in particular in the canonical theory, and even in some of the contemporary forms, they're sexist, racist, and classist in terms of their theoretical constructions, whatever the original or whatever the intentions of those who work in this area are. When you scratch beneath the surface, those things are still there. And I'll give the reason for that shortly. But it is to do with the fact that human capital theorists and their followers are all methodological individualists, although skill-based technical change theorists do kind of acknowledge institutional factors, but they do it in a way which is more flag-waving than actually taking them seriously, which is a paradox because some of them have actually done some very good work separately on institutional theory. Okay, so this has meant that we had to begin the task not only of critiquing and taking apart where we could the theory of human capital, but also the data on which that theory is predicated, the predictions, if you will. But we also then had to do the alternative. Now, you'll recall that I said that Lakatos talked about a hard core of a theory, or the world view. And so what we're trying to do in the third section of this book is to develop an alternative worldview by which we can understand and explain and perhaps recommend in terms of policy ways of changing the assumptions of human capital theories we now have them. And we do that in terms of this rather high level set of abstractions by acknowledging the context in which we now live and the claims relating to education and the labor market. And also, we're making some judgment about the plausible and likely future that we are entering right now. The policy implications here are those medium-term the future in terms of the medium term as we see it. And there's a combination of new forms of technology plus the global auction. And that will necessitate a new understanding of contribution and reward, which are currently confined to the labor market in human capital theory. And there's a point which has emerged over the last 6 months that the work we've done here is actually part of a kind of zeitgeist. Now, it's very difficult to explain zeitgeist, but it's basically the idea that a series of people working wholly independently come up with similar sorts of ideas. So if we move on to the next slide. This zeitgeist includes Mark Carney, who was the head of the Bank of England, director of the Bank of England, who has just produced a book in which he argues that we have confused value and worth with market value. And so there you have exactly a kind of critique of neoliberalism, the very thing that he was central to. And then subsequently also several books on critiques of meritocracy. And we'll see that actually meritocracy, when you look at the data and the theory behind human capital, of human capital theory, doesn't stand a chance. So theoretically, a further part of our approach, and a key part of it, is that human capital theory assumes Say's law. Skill-based technical change theory doesn't always do that, but in the end, it amounts to the same kind of thing. They play with different causal mechanisms, but that's what it comes down to. And that is that the supply will create its own demand. So employers will respond to mass higher education by raising their productivity and employing graduates. So the technology to go with the graduates to raise the productivity. But such a view has been empirically refuted. You just can't make that claim seriously any longer, I don't think, in the present context. Approximately, and it varies by how you make this judgment, but approximately 50% of graduates in the USA and UK don't do graduate work. However, that's judged, and there are a variety of ways of judging it, and they come out with slightly different results. But nevertheless, what we can say is that a significant proportion of graduates don't do graduate work. So one of the fundamental problems with human capital theory is that it doesn't recognize and can't recognize the lack of good jobs. So I've got lack of good then, I mean, of good, well-paid jobs. So that's something we also need to take into account. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to come back to how we've addressed these problems shortly. So the next slide. So now we're going to go on to looking at the data. And I want to explain these data because there have been questions about why we took the data as we have, why we've analyzed it as we have. And the reason for that takes us back to the knowledge economy and the idea of the advent of a fourth industrial revolution. So you'll see in these graphs that we're looking at the periods between 1970 and 2010. And here in these two graphs, you've got men on the left-hand side, women on the right-hand side. And what we're looking at there is those who've gone to university and their returns by decile, graduates in other words, and those from high school and their returns by decile. And what you see is that the only people in either graph there, men and women, who are successful, and I'll say more about the difference between men and women in a minute, are those in the top decile. And they clearly improve in terms of their wages. So they rise from 1970, where they're earning around $61.8 an hour, to 71.8 by 2010. When you look at those rather more close-lit graphs or lines in the middle there, you'll see that the 90th percentile high school graduates earn more than college graduates of the median. Now that's interesting because the same thing applies in England with A-levels. The best A-level students do better when they go and get a job than median graduates in terms of income. And then below that, you've got the bottom decile graduates and the bottom decile school leavers. And to the right, then you have the women with the same thing. And what you see immediately there is that women, by and large, clearly until this day, do not earn the same kind of money with a similar or the same kind of graduate degree as men. So one of the interesting things about human capital theory is that Becker in particular understood that there was a problem both in relation to gender and race. So he saw the problem, all right. But notice how he answered it, and I'll show you the answer in relation to women, and you can tell me whether you think he was being sexist. So if you assume that income is a reflection of productivity, and by the way, another one of the what's if or what if assumptions that human capital theorists make is that indeed, without investigating it, that indeed income reflects productivity. They take it, it's almost a tautology for them, which is in itself quite surprising and alarming to someone who hasn't been trained in this area. So he goes, okay, why do women earn less? They must be less productive. Why are they less productive? Well, they're less productive because they've got lots of tasks and jobs to do outside of work in the home. Therefore, they're less productive at work. Well, I mean, if you try and run that argument today, I think you'd find yourself in a lot of trouble. But the interesting thing is, and quite rightly, but the interesting thing about it is that when Becker wrote that paper in the mid-80s, you know, a wave of feminism had already washed across the Western world. And you ask yourself, well, why did he not take that into account? And the answer is because there's a structural analysis that you would undertake there, both with respect to ethnicity, with respect to class and gender. And that is a no-no. You can't do it under human capital theory because they are methodological individualists. They only believe that it's the individual that is the factor that we need to take into account in the social world. So if we then move on to the next slide. Oh, incidentally, that other slide, I guess this is obvious, but I'll say it anyway. That what that demonstrates is that we don't live in a knowledge economy. Nothing like it. In fact, what we live in is knowledge capitalism. And what knowledge capitalism about is cut price brain power, insofar as they want it at all. It's not to do with rewarding people for their productivity on the basis of their knowledge, or only perhaps the top decile who are given permission to think. Okay, we move on to the next slide. What you see here is to do with factors to do with ethnicity or race, depending on how we understand these things. And on the left-hand slide, you see the numbers going to college, and you see there are differences there with respect to non-Hispanic whites. And you see that with respect to Black, Native American, Latin Americans. And then the one difference there would be with Chinese, Japanese Americans. But then when you shift to the right-hand graph, what you see there is graduate unemployment. And that's highest in 2010 by with Black people, Native Americans, and lowest amongst non-Hispanic whites. And we have further graphs in the book which chart the returns to the labor market returns with respect to ethnicity and race, which goes into this in greater detail. Okay, if we have the next slide. And this is about college median graduates versus high school 90th leavers, the returns to human capital investment, which when you look at those returns, are worst for Black people, Native Americans, and Latin Americans. And only the Chinese, Japanese graduates saw wage growth, real wage growth in this particular period. There is some increase, but it's not very much at all. So when you look at that and you put that together with gender, you'd say, okay, we need structural explanations for this. And incidentally, there's just been a report in this country on race and racism, which has denied any structural factors at all. So it's an open debate as to how we understand these things in the public sphere. But in the academic sphere, I think the debate is, well, to me, it's quite clear. Maybe that's just my own personal view. Let's move on. Okay, so we also have a chapter in the book, which is on human capital theory and development. And the reason for that is that development and human capital theory were intimately related in World Bank policies for many, many years. And what we do is go through looking at human capital theory and its application to development. And in doing so, we take on the work of Hanushek and Weissman, who have been very prominent in and influential in World Bank thinking. And what they have shown with the same human capital assumptions that we've critiqued is that they predict that if you have a high cognitive ability or achievement at the age of 15 using PISA scores, then they can calculate in 30 years' time what the GDP for any country is relative to the educated labor of that country. And that then turns on the question of, well, to what extent does education actually determine wages? And the answer is it's a factor, there's no doubt about that. But there are a whole bunch of other factors involved. And if you don't get them right, then that kind of prediction isn't going to happen. And so, for example, at the time we were comparing Ireland and Korea. Both were in the pre-industrial, contemporary pre-industrial stage, had high numbers of unemployed graduates. And then look at the development of those two countries. Two very different sets of policies, two very different sets of institutions. And when you look at that, you go, okay, it's very clear who the winner here really is. And that has to do with policy and institutions. It's not merely to do with the nature of the education of those people. In what you get here also, and we document, is the brain drain from developing countries to developed countries. So-called, I don't like this terminology, because, so I'll call them so-called, because it's very clear that there are areas of Britain and areas of America, for example, where the death mortality rate amongst young people, particularly young men, is much higher than in countries which we regard as developing. At the same time, there are countries which we regard as developing, which have riches on offer in shops, which is just remarkable. So in the fragmented world in which we live, these are kind of difficult definitions to apply. But nevertheless, insofar as we do, it's not necessarily the case that national investment in education will lead to economic growth, as the World Bank predicted. So we'll move on to the next slide. So Rethinking Human Capital, section 3 of the book. So the first section is the critique of human capital theory, the theory. The second is the empirical data. And the third is rethinking human capital theory. So how do we go about developing an alternative account? And we're looking here at three factors: labor supply or education, labor demand, and economic returns. And you already have picked up why we'd be looking at these things. In education, we argue for a wide curriculum that it's not concentrated on the economy and skills. In part, because the distinction between the economic field and that of the social and the personal is collapsing. Think of this pandemic as an example. And in part, it's because we're confronted with a range of existential problems: climate change, the threats to democracy, inequality. All of these things we need our students, the next generation, if they're not already doing it, and indeed they are, if we think of Greta Thunberg, and all the students that flooded out of schools in this town, as they did across the world, to protest against the lack of progress on climate change, that tells us that we need education to be far wider than just a rather narrow view of the economy, and the link that is made between them, which is pretty bizarre when you think about it, and that's to do with exams and testing. Now, if anyone can explain to me how exams and testing fit people for work if they can find it, I'd be very pleased to listen. So we also reject meritocracy for a number of reasons, but one is that it doesn't work, and our data clearly demonstrates that. And we go for a Sen Nussbaum type view, where it's the capabilities for people to make decisions that enable a life worth living, whether that's their own or the life of this planet. And we think that's important. So that's our kind of critique of education. And in that, we have a real crack at 21st century skills. Every time I hear that phrase, I throw my hands in the air. Every time I hear the term generic skills or soft skills, the same response, I give the same response, because it's not that some of these things aren't important, but they are not skills necessarily, because they relate to character and understanding, and they will always be context bound. I don't think you can have, this is an argument, and I'm prepared to have it, but I don't think you can have generic skills. I think they are always context bound by corporate cultures, by university and education cultures, and assumptions which are made about what constitutes good communication, for example, and that will differ from one society to another. Okay, can we move to the next slide? So rethinking human capital theory in terms of economic returns. And there are several key arguments here, three in particular. Human capital theory assumes we can distinguish between individual and social returns. And we argue you can't make that distinction. It's just a kind of fiction which is spun out. When you really have a look at the way in which it's done, you'd scratch your head often. If the argument is correct that we cannot make this distinction, because in fact, we're all social beings, and whatever I achieve in exams will be based on very many other people's input into that achievement. It's not mine alone in any way at all. So once you make that leap from the human capital theory assumption that you can assess individual returns, then a lot of things follow from this, which are really important. The second point is that contributions and worth cannot be captured by the labor market as it's currently defined. And you only have to think of this current pandemic. Who are the most important people in this pandemic? Are they financiers? Are they bankers? No. They're the people in the supply chains that provide food in shops. They're carers, they're nurses, they're doctors. In other words, what this pandemic has thrown up is something that we should have understood and should be incorporated in all our understanding of rewards and contribution in society. And that is that these people who are assumed to be low skilled, and they may not be low skilled at all, they may just be low waged, and see that connection there. That's a human capital assumption, that if you're low skilled, you'll get a low wage. If you're high skilled, you won't. That clearly is not the case. So contributions and worth cannot be captured by the labor market. If you think of carers in particular, and the amount of informal caring that's undertaken, that would be one example of a further contribution to society. But in terms of the point that we made right early on about the lack of, well, good jobs, then that's quite clear that industrial policy is one route where we can provide some of an answer to that. It won't be the whole answer. I think it's very much more difficult to actually develop good jobs than many policymakers believe. Okay, moving on to the next slide. And here are the policy implications. So notice what we're doing here. We're going, in this third section, we're going, here are some high-level assumptions. Here is what they mean when we look at a bit further on, and when we read the field of how things are developing in the labor market, and we can imagine for the near future, or the medium term at least. And then here are the policy implications. So if we can't draw a distinction between private and social gains, it follows that higher education should be free. Now, this doesn't automatically follow, it needs a few linking statements, but nevertheless, that's the direction in which we're traveling, because it's a social and public good. And notice that there are non-neoliberal or less neoliberal societies, the Nordic countries, Germany, for example, France, for example, where either very little by way of payment is made for a higher education, or it's free altogether. And that suggests they have a totally different view of the nature of the individual to society. And then this view is then reinforced by our data, which tells us that increasingly, and I think it will be increasingly, investment in higher education will be a risk. If you think that you'll recoup your investment in terms of your returns in the labor market. So we think that for that reason, because higher education is very important for all the other reasons I've given, it should be free. We also need to acknowledge that the current labor market does not capture the contribution that people make, and I've talked about that. But there's an interesting thing here. There's a paradox, and it's probably almost certainly wholly unintended, but the Conservative Party in England, and I shall refer to it as England because I don't think they really represent anyone in Scotland, for example, or very few, have developed post-Brexit a view of rewarding farmers for developing their land and conserving their land more than for selling their livestock or their crops. And they're still trying to work out how they're going to do it. But that tells us something about how you can make a contribution when it's a non-market contribution. So isn't it a paradox that it would be a Conservative Party that would begin to take us down that road? We also, I think, need to acknowledge that the availability of good jobs is likely to diminish. And we also need to think, therefore, as there was much discussion at the beginning of this pandemic of the development of a universal basic income, what is clear is that everyone, regardless of background, should be able to earn or be provided with a wage which enables them to survive, given the deep uncertainties that we now confront, if not on a basis of principle. Okay, we move on to the last slide, I think. So the conclusion points us in the direction of the future. And this is something that some of the leading orthodox economists have been scratching their heads and worrying about for a short period of time now. David Autor, who's one of the leading skill-based technical change theorists, is worried about this. And we talk about this in the book and also in the article on skill-based technical change theory. But here's, I think, perhaps the key quote. It's from Robert Solow, who's a Nobel Prize-winning orthodox economist. And here he's talking about what will happen in response to Keynes's short tract on the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. And he says that where labor can be substituted by capital goods, i.e. technology, profits will come over time to absorb an increasing share of aggregate income. Okay, and that's what we're seeing. It's not only to do with technology, of course, it's to do with various forms of greed, but it's there. And then he asks, how shall we live then? And here's his answer, and it's, I think, really important. For our grandchildren and their grandchildren to have a viable world, the ownership of capital will have to be democratized. If capital is the only source of income that matters, then everyone who matters, in other words, everyone, will need an adequate claim against capital. And I think that is the point at which we end the book, and it's pointing in the future, in the direction of the future, and basically saying that human capital theory, at all the various levels at which we've addressed that theory, can't do the job. It's no longer adequate. It's theoretically inadequate, it's empirically inadequate, and it won't help us as we move forward into the future. And I hope, Palisa, that in going through this presentation, I've addressed some of the key questions that you've asked. Thank you very much for listening, wherever you are in the world, and I know that there are people right across this world listening. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Hugh. That was really great. It was really great hearing you talking about it, spending a lot of time reading it and analyzing it and debating the book, which, as I say, we all really enjoyed. I've got a bunch of questions in the chats, which I'm gonna give you. Can I throw 4 questions at you at once? You don't have to answer all of them.
See if I can hold
comment. And then people should feel free to raise questions in the Q&A, and obviously people can also raise their hands, and then we can allow them to speak. So the one question is, and they're very, very different kinds of questions, but I'm going to throw them all out at you. Okay, I've got a 5th one, and as you will know, this is one that we also asked you in our questions to you. It's from Gavin Moody in Canada, and he's saying, so why call your approach the new human capital? And I know that you have said you were writing this book to try and convince people who are within that world, but I think that question is going to keep coming back to you. Someone asked, what do you have a comment on Julius Nera's idea of education for self-reliance? I don't know the person. We have Paul Kamen from the ILO. Great to have you here, Paul. And Paul says, we need to recognize that a focus on generic skills in curriculum can actually improve teaching, learning, assessment, and reporting. Transferability is a fiction and context is central, but don't let's throw out the baby with the bathwater. Paul made that comment when you were talking about 21st century skills, Hugh. So you might want to comment on it in that regard. Then we have someone who says, since HCT is a context-based theory, would you agree that it needs to be customized for implementation in different economies? So I think we could maybe have a debate about what implementation of a theory means. And I guess that was kind of relating to some of the questions that we were asking you. And then we have a very interesting question from Judy Harris in the UK, who asks, what is sense work a theory of? I would love to have that discussion with you, Judy, sometime. The Sen and Nussbaum have been studied for some time and have been around for some time, studied in relation to education. What's new in the way you are recommending them at this point? What is sense work a theory of? I have a few more questions, but I think we will stop for now.
I think this could keep us going for quite some time, but let me just see if I can answer them fairly quickly. Why human capital? I think the answer to that is that when we thought about it, we thought that if we try and develop another theory, no one will take any notice. Look, my view is, I think that we originally hoped that we could engage in a fruitful debate with orthodox human capital theorists. My view now is far more pessimistic about that. But I think that was the intention. So what we were trying to say to them was, look, okay, there's something here that we need to think about. But although actually as you know, we've broadened it out quite a lot as time went on. But we did think that if we didn't talk about human capital theory, people wouldn't link what we were doing to human capital theory, and they probably wouldn't take any notice of it at all. But the very fact that, you know, you've got 110 people here today, I would hope would say something about the provocative nature of the title that would grab people's attention. So that's HET. The Julius Nyerere, I'm sorry, I don't know about that. And I'd be very interested to learn more about it. That'd be very helpful. So thank you for that. Paul, yes, I was being provocative. And I'll make one point against the argument I was putting forward that you might appreciate, which is this. When you look at the non-graduate jobs that graduates are doing in the United States and in Britain, what you see is that graduates, by and large, are employed to do non-graduate work. So the OECD makes a lot of this. It kind of does sleight of hand stuff because, you know, it's so committed to, or was so committed to human capital theory. And it goes, okay, so just because you can't earn a good return on your income, nevertheless, you're far less likely to be unemployed. So by then we're moving way back down the steps of the claims that are being made for human capital theory. But in this case, it's correct. And my thinking, Paul, in this relationship is that the reason why graduates are being used is because, in fact, they do have better communication skills and maybe better team working skills. Or that's the assumption that employers are making, not necessarily that they are, but that's the assumption policymakers are making. So, so maybe I'm coming a bit towards you on that particular issue. In terms of the customization, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to be far more focused on how we relate education to the world of work, but not to the exclusion of other elements that are so, and aims, which are so important in education. But yes, certainly. And Sen, well, I understand the point about, well, where's the theory? And I understand it's hugely complex in terms of education to work out what kinds of capabilities might be desirable and that we should be fostering. But what it does do is point us away from the idea that education is simply for a job. And I think that we were using it in that particular context, not really taking it on much further than that once we've had a crack at meritocracy. Okay, Steph. Any more?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've got some more. I actually, one person is saying, to say that HCT is dead implies that it was once alive. It could have been alive, A, because it explained things reasonably well at one time, but no longer, or B, because it never explained things and people who believed that it did were just wrong. If A is the answer, what have been the main changes over time that have made HCT obsolete or dead? If B is your answer, why do you think so many people were wrong for so long? I think that's a great question.
Can I just answer that question?
Questions.
Can I just answer that question? Because, hey, it's a terrific question. Okay. It was dead from the day it started in terms of theory. When you look at the sexist, racist, and classist nature of the theory, and I've talked a bit about the problems with race and class. Race in terms of Becker, who actually did his PhD on race, argued that race was a matter of taste. So take it or leave it from there. Of course, that's, economists will say that's a technical term. Well, so much for that. Class, I'll give you an example. When I was arguing against human capital theory way back when in the 80s, when New Zealand was becoming a neoliberal laboratory for the world, I was talking to someone in the Treasury, which was the hothouse for neoliberal policies. And I said, well, look, I've got research which demonstrates that even when working class kids can go to university, they don't go. And his answer was, and there have been recent answers in slightly different contexts from such theorists. His answer was, well, they must be wired wrongly. Go figure. So the theory's always been dud. The empirical stuff, the correlations, certainly seem to work from the 50s through to the early 70s. Then there was a decline in the demand for graduates in America. Not quite sure why that was. And then since then, we've got a whole range of factors which don't make the empirical correlation stand up. And they are to do with the theory of human capital, skill bias technical change theory, and the knowledge economy. So that's just a kind of, that knowledge economy and the theories around it are just an imaginary, and they just happen to be wrong. Because if you start thinking about knowledge capitalism, you can begin to understand why people are not getting rewarded for the potential productivity they might have. I see there's a note here from Volker Webkind. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Thank you.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to comment on that. I mean, I think, and I'm really glad, Hugh, that you agreed that we need to have a Marxist analysis of this issue in our written correspondence on it. Because my take of it is that it's a misnomer as a theory. It was never a theory. It was just a name for an observed correlation. But there's no theory which really meaningfully explained that correlation. And that's why it was, and in a way, Michael, who asked the question, people were wrong for so long because it was an observation of an empirical relationship that held in rich countries for a certain period of time. So the observed relationship was there. It's the explanation of what underlay that relationship that was always wrong, but now its wrongness is becoming much more obvious, both in rich countries and in poor countries. So I think it's really interesting. And I also agree with Volker's note. But I've got two other questions, and one of them, I'm not sure if I understood it. So if the person who asked it wants to raise their hand and explain it better, but I'll try. The question is, did you get to see any, or maybe they've raised their hand. Someone has raised their hand. Yes, okay, I'm gonna give speaking rights, and I'll read, I'll unmute you, Raju, and then I'll just quickly read the other question, which is, what do you think of 21st century development movement going into developing countries? How do we need to define and incorporate them into national education curriculum to ensure that the youth has the skills they need to be successful in personal and professional lives? I don't know if you can answer that one, Hugh, but I'm going to hand over now to Raju, who's going to ask their question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I hope I'm audible. So I work with Tata Consultancy Services. I'm coming from a practitioner's perspective, and this is about skill matching platforms. There are various models out there, and there's a lot of reskilling, upskilling that goes on led by the industry, led by academic institutions, and so on. And therefore, there are new models that are coming up, new economic models also that are coming up, hiring of people without even college credentials, and having skills and career paths for them. Also, this dialogue on what is the economic value of a skill, and how long does a skill last? And then there are other emerging models, and I also quote Lisa Wilhan in the last such meeting where she was talking about powerful knowledge versus knowledge of the powerful, and how this gets framed. So my core question is, is this something that you've seen as a market play that might make a difference to addressing the research question of the depth of human capital?
Yes, thank you very much for that, Raju. what I think is that there are ways in which you can develop career ladders, which develop people's skills at the same time. So, for example, there is the beginnings, and they are only just the beginnings of the career ladder, a career ladder for carers in this country. But if you go to some of the Nordic countries, you'll find that they have career ladders there. And if you look at, for example, carers and teachers in terms of early childhood education, they have careers ladders to do that in those countries. And the people, instead of just getting a very low wage as they do in this country, those workers actually get quite a good salary. So there are ways of doing it. There are no doubt ways in which you can develop platforms that link skills to jobs. But the fundamental problem is that by and large, those jobs, the good jobs that we are hoping for, just aren't there. So if I can then go to that first question, and that was a question about how in developing countries, what kind of education is required. So let me say a number of things. The first is that in any developing country, some of the analysis we provided won't work. And it won't work because if those developing countries are developing states, nation states, and they may not, but they certainly were, then you need skilled workers for those nation states. There's no doubt about that at all. But of course, the countervailing force of that is neoliberalism, where you try to have skinny stakes and privatize things. But in states where that is not so obvious, then there's clearly a demand for state workers. So that's part of an answer to the question. The other part of the answer is much more pessimistic. If you look at the way in which technology leapfrogs from the west coast of the United States, for example, to other countries, you find that where there was once a possibility for labor and skilled labor, even if it wasn't well paid, that's now being replaced by technology. And of course, when you look at what's happening in India with the farmers in the Indian states, northern states there, it looks like the Modi government's seeking to develop large supermarkets and all the technologies involved in that, which will exclude the farmers from a living wage. I mean, that's the argument. And you can see how that's kind of playing out. So there are issues here that I haven't got my head around, but people do need to get their head around. And it is to do with how we address these kinds of issues, particularly in developing countries. The alternative is that the polarization between the wealthy in wealthy countries and everyone else is going to just increase.
Yeah. Do we have other comments or questions?
I'm not bringing all good news, Steph.
No, I think it's impossible to bring all good news. I wonder if anyone from our reading group wants to jump in with some of the questions that we asked, or I could read some of them out if other participants don't have questions or comments. The one is, no, I'm just wondering, we had so many, I'm just wondering which I should ask.
If Ruan has his hand up.
Okay. Ruan, you can come in and I'll find the most pertinent questions while you're doing that. Ruan is a member of the reading group that read the book.
I'm unmuted. Thanks, Stephanie. I think, yeah, I think your arguments are brilliant in the book, and I think it's difficult to disagree with it. But what's fascinating for me always with human capital theory is why do people still invest in it? I mean, regular people. Is it because we don't have options really? I mean, if learning isn't earning, what are my options? Must I then start a revolution? And I'm not being facetious when I say that. I mean, you do sort of address the issue of social unrest, but it's, yeah, what are the implications? So let's say the analysis is correct, which I think it is. What are our options then? Must we then agitate politically, organize? Maybe that's the way to go. I don't know. Thank you.
The question that I was actually going to ask from our group relates to that, Hugh. I was going to ask, when you say we need a new kind of human capital, what is it that we need? Do we need, and this kind of relates to Michael's question about is the theory dead? Do we need a new theory that explains the relationships between education, work, and labor markets? Or do we need a new set of policies and goals and a new set of social relations in relation to production and work?
Okay, so if I can respond to Ruan first and then to you, Steph. So Ruan, I think this is a very good question. And what we're seeing right now is what Phil Brown has called and written about, which is the opportunity trap. So the trap is one whereby if you're not prepared to play the game of education in the hope of getting a good job, then you lose out altogether. Whereas if you play the game, the risk of not getting a good job are high. So you're in a trap. And what we're seeing from certainly the government in this country is the intensification of that positional competition. And it isn't going to end well. Already students are going, why are we paying fees? I mean, this is in light of the pandemic. But very soon they'll be going, why are we paying fees at all? And the Corbyn-led Labour Party did actually propose the abolition of fees in this country. So that's part of an answer. It's not the whole answer by any means, because it doesn't address the labour market part of this. And that's really Steph's question. And I think that if I stood right back and asked myself, what is this book about? I'd say that it's about the nature of labour. And if we think that labour, paid or unpaid, is actually central to our lives and to give meaning to our lives, then what we need to rethink is exactly how that works. In other words, how do we find meaningful ways of contributing to a society and using our labor in that particular way? And that is a different question from the one that human capital theory is asking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Yeah, someone commented that developing 21st century skills is not a bad thing, but the issue is not linking it to securing employment. I mean, it's interesting that the MasterCard Foundation last year released a major report about the secondary school curriculum in Africa. And they firstly argue that fixing the secondary school curriculum is the thing that's going to fix African economies. And secondly, they argue that this is going to happen through 21st century skills. So I think, unfortunately, it is a very, very live issue in terms of the role that donors, corporate agencies, and so on are playing in the ways in which they fiddle with education systems in developing countries. I've got a comment from Lisa Wheelahan. She says, thinking about your career ladders, is it part of the problem in Anglophone let it rip markets? The governments have a horror of regulating labor markets. And I've got an anonymous attendee who says, how can this research be applied to the South African context that has a largely unskilled and poor labor force? What are the options from a behavioral and policy perspective? And I'm sorry, Hugh, but I'm going to throw one more question at you. I know you've had a lot already.
Oh, hang on, can I just...
Oh, all right, I'll pause. Okay.
Just remind me of that first question. I didn't make a note of it, and I need to.
I've also forgotten it.
21st century skills and education. Okay. Look, these people are so inured with human capital assumptions. They live them, walk them, breathe them, talk them. And of course, if the book's half right, then that's all wrong. one of the problems with 21st century skills is that there's no room for knowledge. And this takes us back to Michael Young and notions of powerful knowledge, however debatable they are. And one of the interesting things is that we use a quote from a journalist from the New York Times, I think, who says, well, you can get people in a room, you can get workers in a room, and they might have all the skills in the world, but if they don't have the knowledge, they're useless. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. And I think that's clearly a problem. So 21st century skills is a kind of mixture, an unholy brew of genuine skills, partly to do with our characters and partly to do with knowledge. And they all need to be untangled so we get a much clearer understanding of what we're trying to do. So that was the first point. Okay, now remind me of the second one.
The second one was Lisa's comment, your career ladder. She's asking your career ladder analogy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Lisa, I think you're dead right. I think this is exactly the point. But I think we're learning that these neoliberal governments are finding that increasingly they're having to intervene in one way or another. There's no doubt that in this country, the Conservative government was desperate to get back to things as they were. It suited them nicely. But I doubt that that can remain the status quo for much longer. And so various forms of government intervention, whether it be in the construction of career ladders or the development of industrial policy, these are clearly important, not only for individual workers, but in terms of climate change. If we don't operate with sophisticated industrial policies, they're not going to work. So I think that I've written about this before and people keep thinking I'm a hopeless optimist at times, but I think neoliberalism's intellectually, it's probably dead now. And what we've got is the residues of self-interest amongst a global elite that keeps the up thing going, which takes us back to Ruan's point, that if they don't pick this up, then I can see that there will be social problems. I mean, social conflict.
So that leads us very nicely to the next question, which was about South Africa. And I don't know the name, it says anonymous attendee.
Yep. Skills.
They asked, which is a really interesting question, because if you look at the labor force analysis in South Africa, we do have rising graduate unemployment. We have, it used to be around 3%, it's now around 10%. And although it is true that, as anonymous attendee says, we do have a largely unskilled and poor labor force, it isn't clear that giving those people skills will give them jobs, because actually we're the poster child for your argument, Hugh, that the problem is lack of jobs and not lack of skills.
Yeah, Steph, I mean, I know I haven't kept touch with South Africa, so there's not much I can say, but I can say this. When I was in South Africa with you in the early 2000s, my question was, why wasn't there a massive building program of houses in South Africa that would be funded by the state? And that in itself would then give a whole range of skills. I mean, the various forms of skills you need for building are really important. And the answer I got from a leading economist in South Africa at the time was, well, because it upsets World Trade Organization rules and regulations regarding competition. And I said, well, where's the competition in building houses? And they said, well, it may be, for example, that the Czech Republic does fantastic assembled bathrooms and kitchens. So they would complain if we built our own bathrooms and kitchens. It's some argument like that. It wasn't precisely that, but it was like some argument like that, to which my view is, well, now just go ahead and build the bathrooms and kitchens. And, you know, a massive building project won't answer all your questions in terms, Steph, in terms of the demand, but it's that kind of state action that is required to build, literally build South Africa in that sense.
Yeah. And we do now have a COVID economic reconstruction and recovery plan, which does make gestures in that direction. The question is whether or not it will be implemented. And so I was interested in this, and so I wish, Jocelyn, you would actually come in and talk. But we have a comment from Jocelyn Vass, who is not only a PhD student at the Real Center, but also a senior employee at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And she makes an interesting observation. She says, it's interesting that the fees must fall movement in South Africa is only among university students. However, students from TVET colleges have been quiet. My thinking is that TVET college students know that the demand in the labor market is so much less compared to university students. So there is more at stake for university students, as there are so few good jobs, so few jobs, good or not, that they are prepared to fight for a piece of the small pie.
Yep. Well, that's
sorry, she also added in the comment, now we have neither houses nor skills.
Well, that sounds spot on. Absolutely.
Then I have a question from Canada. How might your value of trades and vocational training in Canada, where the skilled trades are often seen as a consolation prize to traditional higher education? And a comment from Alison Taylor, universal basic income has been discussed by various commentators across the political spectrum. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, well, hi, Alison. Nice that you're here, and nice that I can sort of talk to you, although I can't see you in person. So just take me through those questions again. Alison's was about skills, and basically it's about academic drift. It's about the value of why there's the status attached to degrees in a way that there isn't technical skills and vocational. Yeah, I think this is a really important problem. And I only know one country, well, probably three actually, because they're all the same, similar system, not same, but similar systems. And that's the German-speaking countries, where there is a real sense that if you have a vocation, literally a vocation, you're a Meister. Well, that's sexist, of course, but let's use it for the moment, Meister. That gives you standing in your society. And so, Alison, part of the problem here is to do with individualism. If you look at German society, it's much more, in some respects, now, of course, no doubt there'll be Germans in the audience that will jump down my throat, but my experience and of Germany and of reading about Germany is that in many ways, which we might even regard as interfering in some ways, local neighbors take a real interest in you as a person. And if you look at the income salaries of the top executives in Germany, they're not as high as those in Britain and America, because there's a real concern that they are still part of that society. So I think that it's difficult, but there is a question about the social assumptions and attitudes and norms that actually are around and embed work and education, which is so important in all this. And perhaps as less graduates get jobs, then so doing more vocational and technical training and work will rise in status. So that was Alison's question. There was one before or after it.
No. Alison's question was on the universal basic income. The
one
that was...
Sorry, so was someone else. Universal basic income. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the book, what we argue is that we need to take universal basic income step by step. So you start with a universal basic income for people of a certain age, and it could be babies. But you start with people of a certain age, and then you build up as you transfer forms of taxation and increased other forms of revenue. into the investment in universal basic income. I mean, there are countries where elements of it have worked very well. So in parts of India, it's worked extremely well, as far as I can understand. In Finland, yes, there's clearly some success, and we cite that. Scotland has some experiments. There are a range of experiments. But if you're interested in that, then the Institute for Public Policy Research at Bath is a kind of one of the country's leading experts on universal basic income. I tend to disagree with them on some things because I'm broadly in favor of it, because their question is, how do we fund it? But I think doing it step by step so people get used to the idea rather than, well, you're getting money for nothing, is important.
I'm going to give the last question to Yael Shalem, who is also part of our reading group, Hugh. So she was part of the group that read the book. And her question is this: are we not risking the importance of education and knowledge if we declare that HCT is dead? If we agree that you proved that there's a problem with the theory, how do we keep focus on the value of education?
Very, very good question. So let us note, I'm just reaching up for this book here, which is a big edited edition I did some time ago. But in it, there is a paper, and let me just read the title of the paper because it addresses exactly what you're saying or asking. And the title of the paper is, it's like you're going to get an Oscar. Let me just find the paper. It's by two people who've actually sadly now died. Yeah, Norton Grubb and Marvin Larserson. The globalization of rhetoric and practice, the education gospel and vocationalism. And the education gospel is, okay, we teachers know that we're not really interested in employment. What we're interested in is teaching people what we think is worthwhile and valuable. But we have to pay kind of attention to the fact and acknowledge the rhetoric about employment, education, employment. So it's a two-edged sword. And I think what we're saying is that the idea that educators can play both games at the same time is coming to an end. And we need to restate why we think education is important. That's a hell of a risk, but I think it's a battle that we have to win.
And it is, I think it's part of the reason why educationalists have been so seduced by HCT. Because if it's true, then give us money, give the schools money, give the universities money.
Absolutely.
So I think that people would feel that there is a risk in letting it go. So I think that's an interesting note on which to end. Hugh, I just have to really thank you, firstly, for a really great and dynamic presentation. Secondly, for so gamely dealing with so many different and very diverse questions that we've thrown at you. And thirdly, for engaging with the written questions that we sent you from our reading group. It's really been fantastic having the opportunity to really interrogate some of the ideas. And we certainly absolutely agree that it's a really important book. We're going to be prescribing it for our postgrad students. And we just really, really appreciate your time in giving us the presentation, responding, engaging in the discussions. I think it's been a very, very interesting and lively discussion. We've still got a lot of people in the room, so I think that's testimony to the fact that people have really enjoyed it, and there've been a lot of very complimentary comments to you in the chats, Hugh. So, Prish, do you want to, maybe I'll just say one thing before we close, and that is that I think the issue of the complexities of producing technical skills that economies actually do need, and at the same time as building jobs that people actually do need, and doing work that does actually need to be done in society is a challenging one. And I think that that's why we've chosen the topic of skills ecosystems for our next webinar, because we think that that is one set of possible answers to trying to find ways of resolving these challenges. Preach, do you want to say anything about it as we close?
No, thank you again to Hugh, and we look forward to everyone joining us on the 5th of May.
Can I thank you, the real team, and Steph. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I've really appreciated the questions that have come my way. Just terrific, and I shall try and join you for the next seminar as well. And most of all, I shall look forward to visiting WITS again.
Oh, we would really love to have you, Hugh. As soon as the borders get opened, I hope you'll come and visit us.
Yeah,
So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lisa.